Morning. I'm David Cooper, the Cultural Resource Manager at Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. I began my research in and around the lakeshore in 1989 while working for the Wisconsin State Archaeologist's Office. I've now been with the NPS for 22 years, the last 12 at Apostles. On this occasion of the 50th anniversary of Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, I've been asked to look back at the Park Service's efforts to study and steward the lakeshore's human history. In this first slide, we see an aerial view of the Apostle Islands. In this next image, we see an aerial view of a glacier with ice receding and island sediments appearing beneath. The earliest evidence of human presence on the Apostle Islands dates to approximately 5,000 years ago, when seasonal fishers utilized the cluster of islands that we call the Apostles and that the Ojibwa people call the Winnebago Islands. Geologists tell us that these islands would have slowly appeared during the recession of the last glaciers, first as offshore shoals and later as low islands of glacial deposits on the edge of glacial Lake Duluth. Humans may have used this area as early as 11,000 years ago, but the evidence may have been obscured by later glacial advances and inundation by the rising lake waters. Then as now, the islands likely provided a rich resource of fish and waterfowl, particularly lake trout, whitefish, and lake sturgeon. The shallow protected waters of what are now Stockton Island's Presque Isle Bay, seen here to the upper right, and Quarry Bay provided seasonal fishing camps where fish could be harvested and dried or smoked for a winter food source. Thus began the cycle of seasonal rounds that characterized human use of the Apostle Islands for millennia, with spring and summer fishing, collecting of wild rice in the fall, and most likely moving inland to more protected areas for the winter. In this next slide, we see a Red Cliff tribal elder harvesting wild rice on a local lake. To the Ojibwa, this is the place where food grows on water, a reference to the rich wild rice resource of the Kakagan sloughs. It is also known as the Winnebago Islands, named for an Ojibwa culture hero, the first man. A traditional Ojibwa story tells how Winnebago sought to hunt a giant beaver whose massive dam was today's Long Island and Chequamegon Point. And in the ensuing battle, mud from the Great Dam was flung far into Lake Superior, forming the Winnebago Islands. In this next slide, we see NPS and Red Cliff tribal archaeologists surveying at Quarry Bay on Stockton Island and examples of some of the local artifacts. We know very little about these early peoples. We have sparse archaeological evidence of their fishing camps, their stone tools, and fire hearths, but we don't know if they were the direct ancestors of today's Dakota people or the Ojibwa people or northerly tribes such as the Cree. But we do know that humans have used these islands for millennia, probably thousands of years earlier than our archaeological evidence, and have left their traces, whether in the form of archaic hearths, stone tools, fire-scarred trees, or other evidence of a human-influenced landscape. Apostle Islands National Lakeshore was created in part to help preserve these historic and archaeological resources, which are identified in the park's enabling legislation. In this next slide, we see in the upper left the Moe Fishery on Sand Island, a historic fishing station, Old Michigan Island Light in the upper right, and a tribal gathering at Bad River, Wisconsin. These are some of the people, places, and landscapes of the Apostle Islands. In the National Park Service, cultural resource management focuses on 6 disciplinary areas. These include the studies of history, historic architecture, archaeology, ethnography and cultural anthropology, cultural landscapes, and museum studies. Throughout the years, the park has worked to maintain a balanced approach in each of these areas, although admittedly, the Apostles' historic light stations have become the charismatic megafauna of the cultural resource world and have received a large share of attention, both from historians and from visitors. It is a valid criticism that the park has spent less effort on understanding the Native American story, and it is this, where the story of humans in the Apostle Islands rightly begins, that should represent an important future focus for the lakeshore. Archaeologists seek to understand the human past through its physical remains, especially artifacts and other remains found in the soil and preserved in underwater contexts. Archaeological investigations have documented our earliest peoples and have the potential to shed more light on the oldest and least understood parts of the Apostles' human history. In particular, archaeology is a discipline that dovetails most closely with the biological and earth sciences, and in combination has led to a much greater understanding of the lakeshore's paleoecology and paleoenvironments, fire history, and cultural history. Our next presentation by Dr. Dawn Bringelson of the NPS Midwest Archaeological Center, seen here in the slide at the upper left, will discuss park archaeological research in more detail. In this next image, we see an 1849 Ojibwa clan petition and map. Ethnohistory and cultural anthropology are two related disciplines that help inform our understanding of traditional peoples, their cultures, perspectives, and lifeways. The Apostle Islands is home to the Red Cliff and Bad River bands of the Lake Superior Ojibwa. Apostles' ethnohistory is the subject of two early internationally known works: William Warren's 1885 History of the Ojibwa People and Johann Cole's 1855 Kitchigami, both of which explore the history and culture of the native people of the islands. In this image, we see Fire Officer Damon Ponick working on a prescribed burn on Stockton Island, and in the left, a tobacco offering in a ceremony that preceded the prescribed burn. Of particular importance is the documentation of traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and native experiential knowledge, or NEK. The Park Service, in partnership with tribal historic preservation officers in Red Cliff, Bad River, and Lac du Flambeau, have begun the process of interviewing elders and documenting traditional knowledge about the Apostle Islands in their respective communities. Dylan Jennings of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission will be speaking this afternoon about the Commission's intertribal efforts in this area. Damon Ponick, seen here, and Kurt Kiffmiller will also be presenting on the integration of traditional knowledge with modern fire science research to understand the importance of fire to the Ojibwa people and the management of native landscapes and vegetation, such as blueberries, in the Apostle Islands and more generally in the Lake Superior region. TEK-NEK is one of the lakeshore's most fragile and sensitive resources. Every year, tribal communities lose elders and the knowledge base is eroded. And because TEK-NEK is often sensitive, even sacred knowledge, it is not easy or always culturally appropriate to collect and preserve using Western documentary methods. The preservation and integration of traditional knowledge into park resource stewardship practices will be a long-term but very necessary challenge for the NPS. So we'll now turn to look at the park's early years and the development of baseline knowledge of its cultural resources, and look at some of the principal figures in development of our cultural resource program. From 1972 to 1977, the park's cultural resources were under the care of the park naturalist, at that time Warren Bielenberg. Then as now, the NPS Midwest Regional Office, the NPS Midwest Archaeological Center, or MWAC, tribes, partner organizations, volunteers, and many park staff all shared and contributed to the overall effort to study and preserve the park's cultural resources. Collecting for the Park Museum began in 1972 with acquisition of a 3.5 order Fresnel lens from Michigan Island Light, seen here. A multi-year baseline survey of the park's archaeological resources was begun under MWAC contract with archaeologists Bob Salzer and Dave Overstreet of Beloit College, this in 1974. A small team of park volunteers, including local historian Marjorie Benton, collected oral history about the islands. Sand and Raspberry Island lights were transferred to the park in 1975, beginning the process of acquisition of all the Apostles light stations by the NPS, the last, Ashland Harbor Light, being acquired in 2015. The Wisconsin Historical Society was contracted in 1975 to conduct an inventory of historic buildings in the park encompassing over 150 structures and resulting in nominations to the National Register of Historic Places for 5 historic light stations, 2 brownstone quarries, and Shaw Hill Farm and Savona Cottage on Sand Island, seen here in the upper left, and many other National Register listings were to follow. Rocky Island Historic District in the upper right, and on Sand Island, West Bay Club, Shaw Point Historic District, and East Bay Historic District, seen in the lower image. The NPS began stabilization work at Raspberry, Sand, Michigan, and Outer Light stations, although all but Sand and Raspberry were still technically under Coast Guard ownership until 1986. The park also began to make extensive use of Job Opportunity Program funds, a state public works program, to hire dozens of tribal members and other local people to perform park maintenance work, including stabilization and repairs to the historic light stations. And in these images, we see the condition of some of the lights around the time that the park began their maintenance work. Sand Light to the left in 1979, pretty good shape. Outer Light in the upper right slide, 1977, not such good shape. And Devil's Light Station, 1979, this particular building not in very good shape. The year 1975 saw the park's first research symposium, hosted then as today by Sigurd Olson Institute at Northland College in Ashland. The symposium brought together 35 participants from 12 colleges, universities, and agencies. Several of the original participants are joining us again today. There was early recognition that natural and cultural research should be pursued in an interdisciplinary manner, and that understanding the interaction between humans and the environment is essential to understanding the islands. This is a guiding principle of park resource stewardship to this day. In these images, we see birch bark canoe construction at Little Sand Bay in 1976. The national bicentennial years of 1975 and 1976 also saw an interesting park project, partnering with the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwa, to conduct a public demonstration project building birch bark canoes at Little Sand Bay. Tribal members, including now Tribal Historic Preservation Officer Marvin Defoe, were hired to harvest bark, spruce root, and build canoes and other traditional items such as bark containers and baskets. This project helped build public interest in Ojibwa traditional crafts, as well as providing an opportunity to foster and demonstrate these skills. In 1976, 2 full-size canoes and 1 small bark canoe were completed. The 1976 bicentennial also saw the development of one of the park's first museum exhibits, with the reassembly of the large Fresnel lens from Michigan Island Light in the Park Visitor Center at Little Sand Bay. In 1979, Midwest Archaeological Center archaeologist Jeff Richner, seen here in the upper left, began his important 3 decades of archaeological research at the park, including key studies of pre-contact native sites, as well as historic logging camps. Later that year, the park hired its first full-time historian, Kate Lidfors, who began an active park effort to survey and document historical archaeological sites and structures, resulting in baseline studies of the park's logging camps, brownstone quarries, and fish camps. Lidfors also helped facilitate the park's first underwater archaeological survey, the wreck of the schooner Knock Bay in Julian Bay on Stockton Island in 1984, seen here in the lower right. This laid the groundwork for my own team's underwater archaeological survey of Apostle shipwrecks, which began in 1990. Lidfors was succeeded by historian Dave Snyder, who became well known for his efforts to collect and preserve Apostle Island's lighthouse history, lighthouse service records, and historical photos. Dave was followed by park historian Bob Mackrith in 1997, seen here in the upper right. Bob is, of course, known to many of us for his encyclopedic knowledge of park history, and in particular, his efforts to advance study of the park's vernacular history, including commercial fishing, fish tugs, and early recreational resorts and homes. Bob was also a park leader in developing web content and using the internet for park outreach, and he still maintains a web presence today. He has also been an important advocate of working with the community and historical island families in stewarding park cultural resources. Together, these historians have built the bulk of the park's research collections, resource inventories, National Register nominations and special studies, and overall, our understanding of the Lakeshore's cultural resources and human history. We also owe special mention to Nancy Manico, Christy Baker, and Charlene Royce for their work on multiple Lakeshore National Register studies, to historian Jane Bush for her excellent special history, Apostle Islands, People and Places, and local historian Robert Nelson for his book Apostle Islanders. Historians William Cronin and James Feldman have made very important contributions to understanding the Apostle Islands through the lens of environmental history and in the context of the park's 2004 federal wilderness designation. Feldman's A Storied Wilderness provides an exceptionally insightful look at the island's human history and its environmental consequences, while arguing that humans have long been a part of the island landscape. The park's museum program goes back to the early 1970s, when the park was involved in collecting and preserving artifacts related to the Hokanson commercial fishery, as well as donations of documents and memorabilia from lightkeepers and the Bayfield Heritage Association. In 1995, Susan Mackrith, seen here in the upper left and at the center, began her role as the Lakeshore's part-time curator, and I would like to recognize her work in organizing and preserving these collections and the rich community history that they represent. Some of the park's most beloved objects are under care of the museum program, including the original Fresnel lenses from Michigan and Devil's Lights, as well as historic photographs, park archives, and even some original furnishings, including Raspberry's clock, by which the station kept official time. This brings us to our final two disciplines, architectural history and cultural landscapes, which for brevity's sake, I will treat as a combined topic. The Lakeshore includes over 150 historic structures, ranging from small single-hole outhouses to 100-foot skeletal steel light towers, an Adirondack-style log lodge, seen here, remnants of historic farmsteads, fish camps, and a nationally renowned collection of lighthouses, built in brick, stone, steel, and wood. These historic structures are surrounded by cultural landscapes, which include the remnants of gardens, orchards, pastures, and lawns, as well as ancillary structures such as docks, boathouses, ice houses, and privies. Architectural and landscape resources have been the source of an outsized demand on the park's cultural resource program, as they are complex, difficult, and expensive to maintain, and also represent the most intensively used and most intensively visited parts of the park. One early set of management actions with an important but troubled legacy was the purchase and in some cases condemnation of private holdings within the islands and the development of reservations of use and occupancy, sometimes colloquially referred to as life leases, for some of the historic buildings within the islands. In many cases, these federal actions left scars of anger and unhappiness amongst island families, and in some cases, it resulted in displacement of summer residents from the islands and the loss of historic properties. The beloved Air Haven Resort on Rocky Island, a popular stop for island visitors, is but one example. Some of these scars are still unhealed, and the park is working in partnership with the Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy and the Friends of Apostle Islands National Lakeshore to re-engage and involve the island's historical families and use and occupancy holders in the long-term stewardship of park historic properties. A key benchmark in the park's historic preservation efforts was a 1986 act of Congress transferring the remaining island light stations to the National Park Service, formalizing their management by the NPS. Another key event was the Lakeshore's first major historic preservation rehabilitation project, Raspberry Island Light, which took place from 2005 to 2007. 2 years later followed the park's largest historic preservation undertaking in its 50 years, a 6-year, $7 million effort to document, stabilize, and preserve the historic lighthouses on Devils, Michigan, Sand, Outer, and Long Islands. This was a truly massive effort, with planning work beginning in 2009 and construction work running from 2012 to 2015. Work included re-roofing, repainting, hazardous material removal, vegetation clearing, repair of tower footings, windows, and masonry, refinishing of certain interiors, and a museum exhibit for Michigan Light. While this was a significant investment in the historic light stations, much preservation work remains at these locations. In this image, we see Sand Island in the upper left, Outer Island Light in the upper right, and Raspberry Light in the lower image. So it's been a long time getting here and lots of accomplishments. But what next? Even with significant progress, we have important challenges ahead. NPS funding for historic preservation and deferred maintenance is still insufficient to our needs, and partnering and private fundraising will be increasingly important to the park in the future. The park is building strong relationships with stakeholder groups, such as Friends of the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy, the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, and Bayfield Heritage Association, all of whom have donated funding and/or volunteer time to projects that directly benefit park cultural resources. We continue to build on our relationships with tribal partners for whom these islands are a homeland and a spiritual center, especially the Red Cliff, Bad River, and Lac du Flambeau bands, as well as Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. The park is also building stronger ties with the island families who themselves are resource stewards. All this will have important benefits to the quality and focus of our resource stewardship efforts and will help us better address some of the most sensitive issues in park stewardship. In this image, we see some of our partners in action. In the upper left, a team from the Apostle Islands Conservancy and the Friends of Apostle Islands at work on the historic Nelson Cabin at Little Sand Bay. In the upper right, Park Fire Officer Damon Ponick and Red Cliff Tribal Historic Preservation Officer Marvin Defoe. And in the lower right, the Dahl family from Sand Island, describing their family's experiences and life on Sand Island. Our changing environment presents many challenges. Record high water levels and an increase in lake storm frequency and intensity have damaged dozens of cultural resources, literally undermining and destroying sites that have previously endured the lake's wrath for 100, if not thousands of years. Adapting to these conditions will involve selectively hardening eroding shoreline areas where appropriate and feasible to protect individual resources. In a few cases, resources such as small structures may be able to be moved short distances to safer locations. In some cases, we may be able to reinforce historic structures such as docks to better withstand high water and storms. And in some cases, the preservation battle may be lost, and we will need to document a cultural resource before it is lost forever. In this image, we see in the upper left, Devil's Island Boathouse, to the right, West Bay on Sand Island, and at the bottom, Chequamegon Point Light on Long Island, all of whom have received recent damage due to high water and storms. Academic partnering is vitally important for research, obtaining and leveraging grant money, and the cost-effective use of student researchers. Much of our cultural resource work at Apostles has been accomplished in partnership with UW-Madison and Beloit College. MWAC makes extensive use of University of Nebraska undergraduate and graduate students, seen here in the upper right. Through a partnership with St. Cloud State University in Minnesota, we have gained Pathways student trainee Kylene Cullen-Bartnick, seen here to the left, who is currently serving as Apostles Resource and Archaeological Technician and one of today's conference MCs. I hope in the future the Lakeshore will be able to build out more long-term academic partnering in all of the 6 cultural resource disciplines. Anyone who knows me knows that this is my guiding philosophy. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could do only a little. Historic preservation is not a job of great leaps. It is the result of many small efforts, the cumulative growth of work between partners, and the opportunities and energy we find when we roll our sleeves up and dedicate ourselves to a practical common purpose. Devil's Island Light Station, seen in these images, is a perfect example of this, with a long process of brush mowing, chainsaw work, firework, helping restore the original historic opening of the light station. NPS planning and funding cycles can be slow and frustrating, but they are the necessary backbone to our efforts. Meanwhile, partnering can provide us with the flexibility and responsiveness to tackle new challenges in more timely ways, and often can save money in the process. New park leadership is bringing fresh ideas, creativity, and a more collaborative approach to stewardship and problem solving. We are better poised than ever to make the next 50 years of cultural resource stewardship at Apostles a great collaborative success. And I'd like to close with this view of our preservation workhorses, landing craft, and a seasonal field crew. This is where the rubber meets the rock. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take your questions.